Hey, Speech Start here. We're talking about AAC myths today. A lot of people, parents especially, hear AAC and they have an aversion to it. They are scared of it because they say, I want my child to speak. I don't want my child to use a communication board or sign language. But what we need to do is kind of burst some of these false ideas that people have that surround AAC. So I want to let you know that AAC stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication. And we use this every day. I'm using it right now with my hand movements, my facial expressions. So it's nothing that prevents me from speaking, but it complements my speech at times. So AAC is basically any tool that a person can use to help them communicate. Okay, it's a supplement to their communication. So some examples of kind of natural, unaided AAC would be signs and gestures and facial expressions. Then you have low-tech AAC, which might be just a picture board or some picture choices. And higher tech AAC are probably what a lot of you think of when you hear the word AAC. Those are your high-tech devices, apps on an iPad or specific devices like the touch chat or lamp that are designed to be this very complex communication system that can actually speak for the person. So the first myth I want to talk about is AAC will prevent my child from using natural speech, or he will rely on this form of communication and not speak. That myth is false. That's not the case. There's a lot of research and a lot of studies out there that show that AAC actually benefits a child's developing natural speech. Another thing that AAC can do is provide your child with an alternate way of communicating while they're still trying to acquire the language and the speech and those complex motor movements, coordinated motor movements that they need to be able to communicate by speaking. So how can I say that using a form of AAC will benefit your child's developing natural speech? Now, this is not always the case. There's some children that will not develop natural speech. They're going to be communicating in some other way that doesn't involve sounds coming out of their mouth, words coming out of their mouth. They may just communicate by pointing or facial expressions. They may communicate using a picture board or communication system, maybe through signs, or maybe they're able to use a higher tech device where they could have the ability to form these longer sentences and engage in conversation with a communicative partner without ever having to have the words come out of their mouth. But when you look at the research and all the studies that were done, you see a few trends in those children that AAC wasn't used as a last resort. Instead, it was used to supplement and complement their overall therapy program. So one of the things that AAC will do in a therapy program to promote speech development and natural speech use is it decreases the pressure placed on the child. It gives them an alternative way to communicate their wants, needs, and feelings, so it decreases their frustration, and that increases their willingness to participate in a therapy program, for you to be able to place demands on the child and progress with your therapy program. It also reduces the physical demands of having to produce speech. It's a very complicated, complex, coordinated process, and it comes with maturity. And we know children develop at all different rates. And it's okay for them. We just need to give them the tools they need at that moment in their development. Another thing that AAC does is it gives the child this consistent auditory model. So they push a button, they hear the word produced. Every time they push that button in the exact same way, it's immediate. And they start to make this association between that picture of that item, that want, that feeling, and this word that they're hearing. And you often start to see a child who was not imitating at all start to spontaneously try to say what they have just heard or what they keep hearing. So I'm going to jump right into myth number 2, but I just want to point out I love this image here. It's like my favorite image because it just shows how we'll get from A to B, but we're going to get there at our own pace and in our own way. And for some people, it's a straight line and it's super easy. And for other people, it's a little challenging. And that can go for anything from learning how to speak to doing well in your math class to learning how to ride a bike. So this graphic, I think, really illustrates my next point, which is myth number 2. If I use signs with my child, then they're never going to speak. They're going to rely on signs to communicate. And I'm going to say it right now, that is false. If a child is in the yellow here and struggling that much to get from A to B, you need to give them other options to get from A to B, to communicate with you. So what your signs and your gestures are doing, and I tell the parent right away, I use this all the time in my sessions, and it's not because I don't want your child to speak, because I want them to use signs instead. It's because I want to supplement this vocabulary that they're developing, and I want to give them more stimuli, and I want to give them more options to communicate with us, whether they choose to use a sign or they choose to use their words. So what signs can do for a child, whether you use it at home or you use it in your therapy program, is make certain concepts much more visual, much more concrete. It's putting this motor movement with a word, and it's reinforcing not just the word that they're hearing, but the sign that they're seeing that is associated with this word and what it means. And they're more likely to retain that new vocabulary and use it in some way. If they can't get out the word because it's too complicated, too complex, then they can fall back to the sign. And an important thing to note here is they might not do the sign exactly how we do it. And that's okay, especially if there's some kind of motor impairment. What we want them to do is communicate. So we can accept these approximations of signs or gestures, and then that's their way of communicating with us. What I often find when I use signs or gestures or even picture cards to accompany my speech, the vocabulary that I'm exposing the child to and trying to build, is that it's giving them this multi-sensory, multimodal stimulation. So that if, instead of just saying open and pointing to the door, if I gesture open, they can associate this sign with opening the door. And maybe they'll use the sign when they want to tell you, I want to go outside, open the door. Maybe they'll use the sign and the word, but it's giving them options. They know what the word means, they've seen the sign, they know the action, and it's only further enhancing their developing speech and language. One last thing I want to point out is that any form of AAC enhances your child's ability to communicate effectively, and that's the end goal. You want your child to be able to communicate with you, with people outside the home, their wants, their needs, and their feelings. And even if your goal is to have your child communicate through verbal means, through natural speech, you still want them to feel successful and have options for times when verbal communication, getting out the word, may be really, really hard for them. Myth number 3, my child is too young to use AAC. That is false. AAC, if you remember, stands for augmentative and alternative communication. It's communication. Your child has been communicating with you since the day they were born. Different types of cries, if they were wet, if they were hungry, if they were tired, smiles and coos. So any form of communication should be encouraged, whether it's pointing, gestures, signs, pictures, a picture book, pictures that are on the fridge, or a higher tech device. Now, I will say some higher tech devices need to take the age of the child into account, but I have seen children as young as 3 use higher tech devices, and what you need to look at is their foundational and prerequisite skills and cognitive abilities that are needed, as well as motor movements that might be needed to use that particular device. Another low-tech, more natural AAC would be giving a choice of 2 and showing your child, do you want the apple? So now there's 3 ways we're reinforcing the word apple: the sign, the word, and showing it to him. Do you want the apple, or do you want the banana? And you can show the sign for banana, you can show the banana. Give a choice of 2, encourage pointing. And then as you see the child starting to speak a little more, experiment with a little more sounds, you can encourage, once they point, oh, you want the apple? Can I hear ah, ah, ah? And depending on their current level of verbalizations, vocalizations, you can place a little speech demand. You just want to keep it highly successful and very rewarding so that you keep the child motivated to keep trying to communicate with you, and you keep the frustration very low. Last myth, myth number 4. If my child starts to use a form of AAC, they're never going to speak and they'll have to use it for the rest of their life. That's false. We are using it to give them a way to communicate while they cannot verbally communicate, and we are using it to enhance the developing of their natural speech or their verbal communication. Will some children never verbally communicate? Yes. And will those children have to use some form of AAC for the rest of their life going forward? Yes, because we have this capacity to communicate, and we will find a way to communicate. But if we're talking about a child who has a speech or language delay, maybe developmental delays, they might have motor speech impairment, difficulty coordinating or planning the motor movements needed for speech, or maybe even a neuromotor weakness, these children would benefit from AAC in many ways, again, going back to what we said before, as a means to communicate right now while they cannot verbally communicate or use natural speech, and to further develop their speech, further develop their ability to verbally communicate. Once your child is successful at verbally communicating, at using natural speech to communicate, then they may still want to use picture boards at times, or gestures or signs, but it's going to become much easier and more accessible for them to use their natural speech, to just say what they want to say to you. So no, if they can speak using their voice, and that is how they're communicating the majority of the time, then there is really no reason that they would need to continue to use AAC for the rest of their life.